everyone. Welcome to the third session of the International and Interdisciplinary Conference on the Politics of Freshwater. The title of this session is The Changing Water and Land Use. Welcome to here, everybody. I'm Adrian Leung. I'm a freshman here, and I'm from Hong Kong. I'm your student chair for this session. I'm very honored to be co-moderating with Mr. Charlie McCormack. First of all, I would like to make some introductory remarks and introduce the speakers for this panel. First of all, I would introduce Mr. Charlie McCormack. Dr. Charles McCormack is currently the executive chair of the Millennium Development Goal Health Alliance. He serves as executive in residence at Middlebury College. And he's also the Senior Fellow for Private Development Assistance at Interaction and works with other international think tanks. From 1993 until 2011, he was also the president of Save the Children, the world's leading independent nonprofit organization serving children in need. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be co-moderating with you. And so this panel, we have a lot of really great speakers line up. First, Professor Jessica Graybill from Colgate University is presenting. She'll be talking about, her title is Resource Mobility and Flow In, Through, and Out of the Russian Far East, Understanding Social Natural System in Multi-Harvest Resource Spaces. Jessica Graybill is an associate professor of geography at Colgate University, where she also teaches in the Russian and Eurasian studies program. The focus of her research is on coupled human and natural systems in urban settings and in the Russian far north. With students, she works to understand emerging cultural and environmental resilience in post-industrial Utica, due to the influx of former refugees into this shrinking city. In ongoing research in the Russian Far East, she investigates the human responses to environmental change due to social-political transformation, natural resource extraction, and climate change. Secondly, we have Pina Keskin from Wellesley College. And the topic will be the historically evolving impact of the Ogallala aquifer, agricultural adaptation to groundwater and drought. Pina Keskin is an assistant professor of economics at Wellesley College. She holds a PhD in economics from Yale University and an undergraduate degree from Bilkent University, Turkey. Pina joined Wellesley College after serving as a postdoctoral fellow in the Sustainability Science program at Harvard's Center for International Development. Her research interests fall in the fields of development and environmental economics. Pina's work is centered around the determinants and consequences of water access, with a particular focus on gender dynamics and on the institutional context of groundwater markets in developing countries. Lastly, we have Professor Michael McGuinness from Montreal Institute of International Studies. His title will be Creating Ecological Scarcity, the Struggle to Sustain New Zealand's Watersheds and Pastoral Heritage. Michael McGuinness is an associate professor at the Montreal Institute of International Studies. He has published over 100 journal articles, essays, books, government reports, and technical documents on the subject of large-scale ecosystem-based planning and biodiversity conservation. His edited compendium, Bioregionalism, is the primary text in the field. He has received research support from the National Science Foundation and the Department of the Interior, among others. In 2008, he was a Fulbright scholar to the Republic of Montenegro, and in 2012, he completed a 2-year study in New Zealand's marine governance framework funded by the ministries of that country. With that, I would like to say a few words about the structure of this panel. We have 15 minutes for each panelist, and I'll give a signal throughout the time that you have for your speeches. And after all the speeches are done, we're going to have around 30 minutes or so of Q&A, and we would collect questions, and then we would answer them in pairs, I think. And yeah, with that, thank you very much.
I'll be inviting our speakers up momentarily. I do want to take 1 minute in introducing the subject to say a word or two about water and poverty, which is not directly addressed in our sessions. And I'm Charlie McCormick, the former CEO of Save the Children. And from our framework at Save the Children, unsafe water is the world's single largest killer of children and the world's single largest producer of morbidity among children. So, and probably 90% of the world's poor children live in water environments where the water is poisoned in one form or another. And in some ways, we found ourselves constantly, you might say, this is a very mixed metaphor, but putting Band-Aids on water problems. For example, Save the Children is the world's largest dewormer of children. We deworm 45 million children annually. Last night, Bill Cosgrove talked about the malnutrition Millennium Development Goal and how no progress has been made in reducing child malnutrition. 20% of all the nutrients in Africa are consumed by worms and parasites. In other words, 20% of all the land, 20% of all the crops are produced and stored and moved in order to feed parasites. So obviously the importance of including in our macro review of water, water safety is another absolutely crucial factor in producing a better world. And at the same time, we obviously also have to be sure that the water is there in poor communities, but we also have to make sure the water that gets there is safe. And today, it is anything else but safe. So with those introductory remarks, let me invite Jessica Graybill to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so there are so many puns we could make about water, or that I could make about water. I'm going to try to hold it to minimum. But I will change course just a little bit with this talk here. I'm going to be the salmon running upstream for a moment, talking about something entirely different in many ways than what we've been talking about thus far. And that is thinking about how resources flow through water from one place to others. So really, although this is a talk about salmon in this freshwater symposium, I'm going to talk about Pacific Russia today, where human worlds revolve around salmon. The freshwater in which they are hatched and to which they return to spawn is often very much taken for granted in this region of overabundant salmon and water and oil resources. Meaning in this place, no one really thinks about freshwater, only about the resources that flow out, in, through, and away from it. So as I move through this regional landscape today, I aim to show how salmon, oil, and water cannot be isolated. Salmon and people both depend on freshwater for survival in subsistence and industrial ways. However, freshwater quality is changing due to post-Soviet industrial activity, and quantity is expected to change as snow cover regimes decrease with global climate change. Freshwater politics in this region are about things in the water. Those things are salmon and hydrocarbon industrial infrastructure. What the things in the water raise, however, are issues regarding changing access to those salmon in the freshwater, changing quality of water for salmon in riverine and marine waterways, and changing identities related to salmon, human, and modernization through industrialization since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Russian Far East has long been conceptualized as a resource periphery. It is characterized by very low human population densities, as we see in this map here, across seemingly endless tundra and taiga ecosystems, stretching from West Siberia to the Pacific, from the border with China to the Arctic in the north. Archipelago-like population centers are largely clustered in southern Russia along the Chinese border and the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Many places, especially more northern ones, remain inaccessible by rail or permanent road. Thus, this leaves a vast swath of the Russian Far East, approachable only in a few ways and only for a few months of the year. Winter affords the greatest mobility here, by dog sled over frozen rivers, more recently by ATV over snow and ice roads. Only in the last 30 years has air travel been considered viable for moving people and resources in and out of this region, and then only for some people at a price. Resources include, historically, fur, fish, metals, minerals, timber, and currently hydrocarbons. Today, in the post-Soviet era, the relatively open, politically and economically, Pacific Russia gateway draws transnational actors to extract salmon, gold, platinum, coal, oil, and gas. That's a lot of resources. It is only through the combination of sheer desire for money and ingenuity of multiple people's uses of riverine and marine waterways that resources flow in, through, and out of Pacific Russia today. So if we take the same space but a slightly different map and look at the topography and bathymetry of this region, we can see something that is not unique worldwide, but certainly is large in extent across the North Pacific. And these are shallow marginal sea basins that are rich in two main resources: hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas, most commonly, and fish resources, among which we could count crab, scallops, pollock, and of course salmon. The combination of these shallow marine basins, cold water temperatures, and easy access to thousands of freshwater streams throughout the coastal regions of here allows both of these resources to be easily harvested here. The rush for the multiple resources here, and we've certainly seen it across Alaska, right, and British Columbia with many of the several of the same resources. The rush today for extraction here in the Sea of Okhotsk region, over here in the north and the Russian side of the Pacific, is a prime example of how resource flows come to a head at once, leading to freshwater politics. And the politics here are issues of changing water quality, access to fish, and changing identities with changing fish populations. While both salmon and oil and gas spend time in marine regions, both of these resources come onshore during the ends of their life cycles. Right? So this is a different way of looking at resources. Both come onshore from the marine area to, shall we say, die. Thus, both salmon and hydrocarbons utilize onshore spaces and water resources for production, although in vastly different kinds of ways. So if we zoom in on just the Sea of Okhotsk area, we can see the extraction spaces in this resource periphery over time. This map gives an overview of the isolation of the region, noting the three main population centers, which range from about 100,000 to 200,000 people each, across an area that is today only accessed by air, right, by plane carry, or by helicopters, or by very, very long terrestrial or marine voyage. We can see also here where some of the historic places for taking out placer mining materials, gold, cobalt, platinum, etc., have happened up in these black, this is a very hard map to color on, in these black triangles all around this region, as well as onshore coal and oil, and today, in the post-Soviet era, adding on those bright triangles for the offshore regions. Fish is invisible here, but it is absolutely everywhere. It must be noted as being part of this. Okay, so if we go back to this human population density map, we can see and overlaying the oil and fish resource flow here shows us that fish is consumed locally to globally, and oil and gas are consumed regionally and globally. Fish and water resources are harmed by the oil and gas development, which doesn't make local people very happy, or think that either, thank you, one, the actions of oil and gas companies are sustainable, or two, that their food resources are sustainable either. This becomes really important for understanding human responses to change and changing resources flows throughout this region. So I'm going to dive to thinking about fish for just a moment and thinking about the Pacific salmon life cycle. Whoa, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. The Pacific salmon life cycle. So there's a basic life cycle that we need to know about the importance and the politics of freshwater systems here. While there are differences in the exact timing and lengths of life cycles of each species of salmon and in geographically distinct subpopulations, there are more similarities across all these groups. Spawning occurs in late summer and autumn in cold, fast-moving currents. Eggs are laid in something called redds, which are upstream gravel pits that female salmon dig out with their tails and which males fertilize. After hatching, juveniles called par stay upstream, I'm going to emphasize some words here, stay upstream in freshwater for weeks to years, depending on species, and then migrate downstream out to the coastal oceans for 1 to 3 years. There they spend time in the subarctic Pacific feeding grounds before returning upstream to spawn and die. Why I'm emphasizing this is the following. Mineral, oil, and gas extractive industries also use the terms upstream and downstream to describe different stages of resource extraction. Upstream means extraction, whereas downstream means refining and transportation. Researchers and activists operating in multi-harvest resource regions can only benefit from understanding and utilizing both lingos here when trying to describe the geographic locations and human responses to environmental degradation. I appreciate this image of salmon life cycles, but recognize that environmental conditions through which salmon flow are equally important to understand the fitness of their environment and of the fish themselves. So let's take a brief moment to understand some of the language used to describe these resource flows for both salmon and hydrocarbons, potentially to understand spaces of environmental conflict. This chart's got a lot of stuff, so bear with me for a second here. I'm going to talk first a little bit about extractive industry lingo here over on the side and the activities that happen in those different upstream, midstream, and downstream places. If we just put this next to a salmon life cycles with their geographic extents, their life spaces, if you will, we can see that there is some similarity in terminology, but a difference in places. So upstream, downstream, then coming back upstream as they go from early, mid, to late life. Right, so the oil industry has one set of terminology and salmon has another for thinking about it. We would hope they'd have different terminology, but sometimes they overlap. And it creates environmental spaces that are unique in each place in terms of the upstream and downstream activities that are taking place. Now why, again, I want to stress this is important to unpack a little bit, is that working in these regions, if you have any environmentalist leanings, really is necessary to understand both of these to know who's talking about what kind of upstream or downstream is going on. Okay, so what are some examples of this? We can think about upstream mining. So looking at some of these examples of geosynchronicity, if we will, right? Not just thinking about time, but spatial aspects of things happening at the same time. Upstream mining and upstream salmon. We can think about some of that mining historically in the past has looked a bit like this, thinking about gulag mines that have been there since the Tsarist era, not active today, but still remnant on the landscape. Creating places that have tailings, as we heard about yesterday with Bertinsky's lecture, coming into the ocean or marine or terrestrial waterways in new ways. So gold, platinum, cobalt extracted today from placer mines where fish spend their early and late lives. We can think about upstream oil and downstream salmon. Right? Oil is extracted from oceanic subsurfaces where fish spend their midlife from 1 to 3 years old. We can think about that midstream oil or upstream salmon. Oil transported and lightly refined happens across these islands, this Sakhalin Island particularly, as oil is taken out of the ground in the offshore regions, transported onshore to then move down to a terminal to be shipped out and away. Crazy, right? So oil transported and lightly refined happens where fish hatch, live for their first few months, and return to spawn. So what does this mean? It means freshwater, upstream habitat is degraded from upstream and midstream extractive operations. I've shown you some pictures of Sakhalin. You could say the same things about Kamchatka. All right, so the ideal is here on your right, thinking about stream flows and salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest and what they look like today in Sakhalin due to activities of oil and gas industry. So what's the effect of these mixed flows of resources up and mid and downstream? Thus far, for transnational oil companies, it's been protest against them, mostly by environmental NGOs, indigenous peoples, and the federal government. However, local people and local regional governments have not protested to the same degree, which is part of the politics of this region. I've written about that elsewhere, and for the sake of time, I won't talk about it today, except to mention that this protest is happening. Resource spaces, then, are highly contested, where the latest newcomer, the transnational oil actor, has harmed salmon resource extraction areas. These spaces of contestation are well mapped out for Sakhalin, but it's only beginning on Kamchatka in the big oval area that I circled here. Oil and gas is only under exploration, not extraction at this point, but we could call that contested space in the middle for onshore mineral removal. Okay, so what's the human response to this? Well, and we can't forget, coincident with transition to a market economy, so-called market economy, after 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, overharvest certainly is the response that most people are taking because they're living in subsistence style ways. This is a return to subsistence living. This absolutely has to be marked. During the Soviet era, this did not happen. Harvest did not happen to the same extent that it is now. So this is a return to subsistence fishing after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So one of the questions that gets raised, and is all about politics, is this actual overharvest or just renewed harvest? It depends on who you ask. This is certainly overharvest. There's no question here for thinking about poaching salmon for the roe, for the eggs, for commercial sale. This is the biggest activity on Kamchatka for local people and indigenous peoples. You can make about 10 grand in one poaching season, and where salaries are on average about $500 a month, this is big money. Okay. Some of that overharvest of salmon, which is currently occurring for the roe, the eggs, is leading to decreased salmon runs, not unsurprisingly. That means for some people a change of harvest to a different fish, smelt, but smelt are the fish that salmon eat in the marine waters, right? So all of this is tied together. So this tale of changing common resources as socioeconomic situations change and as hydrocarbon extraction ensues is not new. But the amount and modes of overharvest of this freshwater resource are shocking and will likely lead to decimation of salmon in this region in Russia. For scientists and activists seeking ways to understand change this trend, one more column needs to be added to the chart. I won't make you read the whole chart again, but just this last one. And Dr. Cosgrove alluded to this yesterday evening, thinking about human response. Right? Human response is one of those critical things to understand what's going on in a region or how things might change. So one of the things we can see with this is if we divide these out by early, mid, and late activities for both salmon and oil, is that we've got Russian activities on Russian territory that are largely about overharvest. And we have some control in the international waters to create less catch, right? Less overharvest of these very same resources. But they happen at different points of their life. Okay, so if we think about that idea of lifetime fitness from the biological literature about salmon, we can think about a couple things here. This is my last slide, I promise. This concept attempts to address what salmon need through their lifetimes to survive as they move from fresh to saline waters. Not only do they need to make it out to sea initially, but they need nutrition in the Pacific Ocean in their youth, and then the right water temperature to make their heroic swims back up to their natal rivers. This means they need unpolluted cool waters in the subarctic Pacific to feed, and unpolluted cool waters to swim upstream to spawn. If they don't have these conditions, they do not have the fitness to make their epic journeys. Their anadromous nature makes them susceptible to changes in riverine and marine environments both. But the timing and places for on and offshore oil extraction and onshore processing and transportation coincide with major moments of salmon life cycles and life fitness. In other words, the flow of geological and biological resources coincide spatially and temporally, impeding lifetime fitness cycles of salmon in the Sea of Okhotsk region. Unpacking these temporal and spatial synchronicities is very important to unraveling how salmon populations might be protected in different stages of their lives. This talk will not address global climate change because there's no time. But you could imagine with continuing changes, particularly in water quantity in this region, all of this is going to become a different game in the future. And that really wraps up to where I'm going next with this work overall. I'm going to leave you with one image. And I know it's a little bit hard to see here, but I'll explain this here for you a little bit. This is an image of ATV tracks. And an ATV, oops, I don't have a good picture. Well, I'll show you a picture in a minute. These are pictures of ATV tracks. We would call it a tank, right? Left across Kamchatka's tundra. Salmon streams almost disappear. I can't use that. Forget how you do it. There's a salmon stream right here. The salmon streams disappear behind the tread tracks of these tanks. So they disappear amid technological traces of our human activity here. So this is a landscape of oil, right? Tanks run on oil, right, to get the fish to us in our markets. So this should give us much food for thought about our multiple harvest activities in such places. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Pinar?
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for the kind invitation and organizing such a beautiful event where it's so interesting to see all these different perspectives about more or less the same subject. So what I will do is, I think I'm the only economist in the list of presenters, so I will start talking about how we are looking from a little bit of a different perspective. And this is a joint project with Rick Hornbeck from Harvard University Economics Department. And what we did here is looking at one of the biggest natural experiments of the United States, which is, I will explain shortly, but is the existence of this gigantic groundwater source in, like, basically under 8 states, which are lying starting from South Dakota all the way down to New Mexico, one of the biggest groundwater resources of the planet, actually. So what we did is actually motivated by the same question which put us all together in this room, that water scarcity is an increasingly important policy issue. All different parts of the world, and according to Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, according to their 2007 estimates, actually 1/3 of the world population is facing some sort of water scarcity. What do I mean? Some sorts, there are some people who are, such as Middle East, for instance, there are people in different parts of the world which are facing physical water scarcity. Simply, there is no water there. And there are some other parts of the world, surprisingly, for instance, most parts of Africa, there are water resources under the ground, above the ground, but we don't know how to economically deliver those water resources to the users of the water. So there are some people who are actually, I think someone used the term socially or distributive purposes, actually water is scarce in those parts of the world. What is the consequence of this scarcity? Of course, as the water becomes increasingly more scarce, what happens is that actually interest in using water more efficiently, both in terms of physical definition of scarcity and in terms of economic distribution of water, continues to build. And of course, regardless of how we use water, in whatever use of it, what are the main users? We can think about agriculture, which I will do today. Basically, agriculture all over the world use more than 80% of all the fresh water resources. So they are the biggest users of water. Of course, we drink water, but that's a very, very tiny percentage. We are talking about maybe 5 to 10% of all the water use for in US, you would say the municipal water use. Most of the water, actually, there's new trend is now diverting from agricultural use to industrial water use. What gives a piece of paper smoothness? Actually, water. Paper production industry is one of the biggest consumers of world water resources right now. So there are different uses of water, obviously, and whatever we make a decision in terms of governments, in terms of local bodies, whatever allocation decision we make, there will be some kind of a cost for the other users. And of course, as an Econ 101 class, I would define this as the opportunity cost for the society of our decision about the water use. And it's really important at this point, since the water use in one sector will cause some actually generate some opportunity cost for the others, we, both as economists or the policymakers, need to understand the value of water in these different uses. And what we try to do is exactly this in this paper. And we started with a very simple research question, that is, what is the value of groundwater access in agricultural production? It seems like there are like millions of people thought about exactly the same question, and probably you think that the answer is already there, which is not necessarily true. And the second research question of this study was how quickly and by how much agricultural producers are actually adopting their behavior depending on the water availability, or of course in the big scary climate change scenarios, what will happen when the waters start disappearing. And finally, which is most interesting part for us, is to answer the question, how does groundwater access interact with the impacts of drought? Again, this is trying to push the paper or our study to a little bit of the climate change discussion. Why? Because we still don't know the right answer for the simple question, why the water is so valuable, agricultural purposes. Is it coming from the fact that actually accessing water gives a farmer the ability to irrigate their farm in a day-to-day basis? That's one thing that would be very valuable. Or is it coming from the fact that actually it provides some kind of insurance? So which of these values are, which of these things are more important compared to the other? So earlier studies, of course, there are lots of attempts to answer this simple question about the valuation of groundwater for agricultural uses. Most of those studies were using a technique called hedonic valuation. What is hedonic valuation? So whatever economic good we are talking about or service we are talking about, in principle, we pay a price for an economic good, and that particular good normally has many attributes. So when you are buying a house, actually you pay some money, the fact that the house has 5 bedrooms, and some other, just because it looks over the sea, and there's some other add-on that you are paying for your house because it has a huge yard. Some of this stuff are actually sold in the market separately. Like you can separately sell the yard of the house and get some money out of that, but there are some other characteristics of your house which are not really sellable. Like you cannot sell one of the bedrooms. I mean, you can, but I wouldn't. Anyways, so this hedonic valuation really works, and of course the same is true for the land. So when you are giving a certain price for a piece of land, you are actually giving some money for the cultivation quality of the soil, etc. But of course the water which is underneath your land as well. So what people did or tried to do so far was basically contrasting the values of 2 pieces of land which are observably similar. One has access to water resources and the other one do not have access to water. But of course the problem is very obvious, that water access is normally correlated with so many other things about the land itself. The fact that there's water under the land means most of the time that the soil is better quality as well. So it's really hard to, even with the most complicated econometric techniques, we as economists couldn't really answer that question truthfully. What we did different in this study is using this gigantic natural experiment that United States history provided us, which is looking at the water access of farmers in US through Ogallala Aquifer. Why it's such a huge natural experiment for our purposes? Because Ogallala was a huge body of water which was trapped under the area millions of years ago when the Rocky Mountains were coming up. I think there are lots of geologists, people who knows the literature better than me, but this is more or less what happened. And portions of Ogallala Aquifer, this huge water body, actually discovered around 1890s. So through geological surveys, people realized that, there's this huge water body there. Was it available for agricultural use? Unfortunately not, because the water was still too deep for us to access the water. Of course, there were some, windmills which make the water, carry it out from the ground, but you could maybe have 5 pieces of animal, with the water that you can have. So it wasn't really economic use of the water. What happened, only after 1950s, World War II veterans coming back from Europe brought the necessary technology to use for the pumps to irrigate the lands using Ogallala water. So there was some new technology which is basically called central pivot irrigation, which made the Ogallala water economically accessible. And actually, for those of you who fly frequently from East Coast to West Coast and flying over Kansas or one of the Ogallala counties, when you look down from the plane, which is totally visible, and people claim, not my claim, people claim that you can even see from the space. So you can see these huge circles in, these are two counties, thanks to Google Earth, two counties which are in the state of Kansas, and one of them is on top of Ogallala water access, and the other Ogallala aquifer, and the other one is not. So you can see the huge difference in terms of the irrigation potential. And why those circles? Because central pivot irrigation, as it kind of name implies, that you have a pump in the middle and then it basically irrigates through the circles. So this is what is the difference between Ogallala counties and non-Ogallala counties. What we did in this work is we went back to 1890s and started to put together agricultural census data. Luckily, US is a country where there's lots of information about anything I'm not an economic historian, my coach is an economic historian, so that's mostly his work in terms of putting data together. We merged the information from US Geological Services about the boundaries of the aquifer with the agricultural output data. And of course, the land values, etc., all the agricultural census data. And what we did is we tried to evaluate the cross-sectional differences for each year. What is the difference in terms of those outcome variables, including land value, between Ogallala and non-Ogallala counties? Basically comparing the outcome for that county in Kansas versus this county in Kansas. And then what we try to do is, since we have a huge time series, we managed to look at how that difference was actually, we look at before 1950s, before the water access, and showed that actually there wasn't a huge difference between Ogallala and non-Ogallala counties. We look at the period after 1950 and try to figure out what is the timing of the reaction of the farmers to this availability of Ogallala water. What we did, and later on we add the fact that actually there are some years where the drought was actually serious, and there are some other years drought wasn't such a big deal. So try to see whether the farmers changed their decision depending on this external factor of drought as well. And we have lots of Greek letters in our original paper, which I won't bore you. So we have a theory which is explaining all this, but forget about it right now. So we start with merging the census data with the digital maps of Ogallala. And here is Ogallala. So the gray area is where the water sits down, and all those little squares are the counties that we looked at. So we have 368 counties in our data set. So the gray area is with Ogallala, and our comparison counties are the ones which are in the white squares. So we were looking at Ogallala water. By the way, the amount of Ogallala, according to Environmental Protection Agency's estimates, if you pump Ogallala today, you will cover entire United States with 1.5 feet of water. So we are talking about a huge amount of water here. And as a first cut, what we did is comparing counties. We divided counties into two categories. One is the counties which has 0 to 10% of its land on Ogallala versus counties which has 90 to 100% of its land on Ogallala. When we compare those counties, we found that right after 1950s, so the dashed line is the Ogallala counties and solid line is non-Ogallala counties. If you look at the irrigated farmland acres, what we find that actually it's definitely true that after 1950s, so they were coming very close to each other. Basically, there was no irrigation at the beginning in early 1900s. After 1950s, we start to have this huge gap. So it's true that irrigation definitely started to take place around 1950s in this area, in Ogallala counties. But, and similarly, when you look at the land values, I will show you the numbers later, but when you look at the land values as well, initially non-Ogallala counties were relatively better off. The solid line was above the dashed line, but after 1950s, you start to see that the trend changed. So Ogallala counties start to become more valuable immediately after 1950. People knew that there will be more coming up. But when you look at, in terms of, one of the main crop which is grown in this region is corn, when you look at the corn acreage, actually what you see is that Ogallala counties weren't doing better immediately in terms of their corn production in the 1950s. What happened is that farmers took a while to adopt their behavior, and only after 1970s they start producing more water-intensive crop, which is corn. They start switching their behavior from wheat production to corn production. I can look at this in a more detail. No, this is just a simple cut of whether you have water or not. I can look at actually some maps by year and try to figure out actually there is a change in terms of their outcomes or the irrigation potential. So this is looking at the Ogallala maps in 1935 versus 1974. And what we see is, this is like the amount of land which is irrigated is more or less pale in the Ogallala region and non-Ogallala region as well. Maybe there's a trend up there, there's a surface water source. When you look at 1974, Ogallala region start to darken up, like there is more and more irrigated land inside Ogallala versus outside. The same is true for farm value as well. There is more of a trend in terms of farm value that is like closer to Iowa. Even in 1920s, farmland was more valuable because probably it's like more fertile land. But when you look at here, especially look at the Texas Panhandle down there in the south, after 1960s, the valuation of land is higher inside the Ogallala as well, which is kind of like easy to see here as well. Then, of course, this wasn't enough. We ran some, again, I'm not showing you any Greek letters, but this is just, I'm an economist, like I need to have one slide with those. So we ran some econometric analysis, which gave us some very interesting results. And I promise that I will wrap up very quickly. Ogallala land value premium, actually compared to nearby similar areas, told us that market value of water, these are all in 2002 dollars. In 2002, the value of water, whatever the premium add up to, was around $12 billion for all the water under Ogallala. In 1974, the number was, at its peak, it was around $29 billion, according to our comparisons. And potential current value may be actually substantially higher because now we have better ways of irrigation, etc. We can talk through the coffee, like after this. Like, let me not spend too much time on that. But what's also interesting that irrigation increased gradually from 1950s to 1978. That initially, actually, the main increase was that there was a huge shift in terms of dry land farming. And after that, after 1978, we also start to see that there is more land which is entering to agriculture as well. So there's an increase in the extensive margin after only 1978. Which is most interesting for us is the following fact, that crop cultivation adjusted very slowly to the water access. That is, farmers did whatever they were doing for 20 years. There was huge persistence, like even though they start to pay this huge premium for land, only after 1970s they changed their behavior. Before they were producing wheat in 1950, till 1970s they continued to produce wheat, but this time adding water on top of that. So they didn't change their behavior after they changed to more water-intensive crops. But this is a very striking fact when we start to think about the climate change scenarios. Why? Because, let me forget about the data description. Once we add the drought data in our analysis, what we found is that actually when we compare the counties which are on Ogallala, or the Ogallala counties versus non-Ogallala counties, what we found is that in the very first years of the use of Ogallala, that is between 1950s and 1970s, actually farmers who were living out of, on the Ogallala region were doing a lot better off. Why? They were producing wheat anyways, and they now had access to this kind of insurance of the irrigation. So they were doing definitely better in a bad rainfall year. Why? Because Ogallala, non-Ogallala, you are both producing wheat. Only difference is that Ogallala counties has the water now. What is interesting is that after 1970s, once they changed their cropping pattern and start to produce this super water-intensive crop in a very dry environment, just relying on Ogallala, in a bad rainfall year, even the Ogallala water wasn't enough. So they increased their risk by changing their cropping pattern. And I think I will wrap it up here by saying a couple of things about what is the reflection of that for, for climate change discussion or for developing countries in the world. First of all, you can think about just the symmetrical impacts when the groundwater starts disappearing. So in our exercise, we were fortunate enough, we say that, oh, there's water. What will happen when the water disappears? Water disappears, probably just the reverse will happen. What does it mean? Maybe in 20 years we will suffer a lot in terms of the consequences of climate change, but soon we will adapt and learn how to use water a little bit more efficiently. Maybe we will start to not eat cornbread all the time, but like we will learn how to change our behavior. And maybe the climate change stories are not as scary as we want to think about it as economists in general. And of course, this is true for developing countries more, where there is no formal insurance markets. So access to water, if it really works as an insurance against the agricultural weather risk, then it's great. But I think I will stop here. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Pina. Now, Michael McGinnis.
See if I can find my talk here. There it is. Good afternoon. I wanted to thank the affiliates of the center and the Middlebury College faculty and students for inviting me. It's a great bunch of talks, learning a lot, thinking a lot, which is really the goal of any great, well-organized conference. A concept. I'll introduce a concept to you. The Maori of New Zealand, the iwi, the tribes, have a wonderful concept, and it is katiakatanga. Katiakatanga is the Maori epistemology of place, and that concept of place starts with where your canoe landed, or your vaka, on the coast. And as you took your vaka upriver and found a mountain like Taranaki, Katiakatanga embraces the place you inhabit, the region you inhabit, the river, the coast, the mountain. It is your kin. It is part of your kinship. And I think in some respects what I want to focus on, and it builds on the prior talks in many ways, is the redemptive journey to a new homecoming in some respects. And perhaps with a focus on New Zealand, discuss how New Zealand is in a process of perhaps a return to Katiakatanga, but not without major consequences on its own social identity and its sense of place and the denaturing effects of industrialization. Most of you probably have an image of New Zealand as this wild frontier, beautiful landscape, pure, wild. In fact, there is no such thing as New Zealand. There is Zealandria, which is an area of 400 islands that's separated from, certainly the Horn of Africa to some degree under Pangaea, roughly 200 million years ago. And the animals and plants and insects, the communities that make up New Zealandria, make it a Noah's Ark. Everything from that blue penguin, pygmy blue penguin, which is an incredibly beautiful little species, to the albatross, islands of the albatross, connecting across the Pacific coast and the Pacific Islands and Oceania. Rivers. This is a river conference, and the rivers of New Zealand, I think, invoke that wildness and that wilderness experience. But as I'll describe, the rivers are undergoing major transformation. One of the things that I find unique about New Zealand is that in 1991, I think to some degree because of a broad social movement, New Zealand redrew its political boundaries to reflect catchments. No other country in the world has done this. We talk about integrated coastal management or integrated watershed planning and the like, but no country really has dealt with the political barriers or the economic barriers or the administrative barriers like New Zealand has. In 1991, through the Resources Management Act, they, as I mentioned, redrew the political boundaries to reflect major catchments, and these are the regional councils that they created. It connects the mountain with the river with 12 nautical miles of the nearshore marine environment. So regional councils literally have responsibility over this very unique coastal marine interface. And I want you to keep that in mind, because this innovation for many years was thought of as the premier model to emulate in terms of watershed planning and management, but it has undergone some change. Certainly those rivers, those mountains, I think are part of the pastoral heritage of New Zealand. And that pastoral heritage, or perhaps the pastoral romanticism of New Zealand, is what the major campaigning effort of that country to create a New Zealand pure 100% brand. And you see it in their honey, in their milk, you see it in their tourism. Most of you probably buy into that 100% pure brand that New Zealand has propagated over the past 20 years. I think my goal is, in some respects, to peel back that green veneer and look underneath it and see that, in fact, New Zealand isn't quite 100% pure. As their Prime Minister recently said in a BBC interview, well, maybe we're 90% pure. Or maybe we're not really that pure, but we're purer than other places. Well, how pure is that brand? That brand actually, taps into that pastoral romanticism, but it is also under increasing challenge by a mechanistic sensibility. And if you're a student of Leo Marx, he talked about, the tug of war between two ontological positions or worldviews. One was the pastoral romanticism that in some respects drives the American experience, and you see it in the work of Thoreau, the wildness motif or mythology of the past, the lost Eden of the Puritan ethic that drives the Restoration movement in some respects in the United States. But you also see this mechanistic sensibility that's also part of that worldview and that ontological divide. And I think in some respects this brand reflects both these worldviews, this ontological divide. And I want to play that out a little bit more with respect to their catchments. So think about these two forces at work. And I think in some respects a lot of the talks today reflect this. The denaturing effect of the LA River, the loss of wild salmon to the Pacific Northwest. I mean, there's 214 subspecies of salmon in the Pacific Northwest that are on the verge of collapse. And it is because of hydropower and the organic machinery of terraforming the landscape. It really is this pastoral mechanistic sensibility that I think is part of the movement and the ecological movements, the social movements. But in New Zealand, this radical transformation has occurred within the last 8 or 9 years. It's threatening the brand. It's challenging the social identity that the people, in fact, buy into. And that is the loss of the small family farm, the loss of the sheep farmer, which grew out of World War II into the 60s, the replacement of that small family farm with large dairy production. And so I want to give you some evidence of this transformation, the mechanization of the landscape which follows dairy, and some of the ecological consequences, and then contribute perhaps with a discussion of how social identity is also changing as the landscape changes. This rise of dairy cattle is a really interesting aspect that if you do drive around New Zealand, you see that pastoral aspect, the green New Zealand, but it's in fact all non-native grasses in the lowlands feeding dairy cattle. And so within this figure, you see the loss and the decline of sheep farming, the rise of dairy and dairy cattle. The top island, northern island, you see in beige, the area that's actually grazed, and it's incredible. Roughly 37% of New Zealand is grazed for dairy, and that's primarily lowland areas. The latest Minister of Environment report noted that 52% of the monitored rivers are in poor or very poor condition. That was not the case 15 years ago. This is a change that has been brought on by a change in land use. One of the other aspects that I think is somewhat interesting is that you have the essentially decline in the number of herds and the rise in the average herd size, which means that, again, part of dairy in the past 10 or 11 years has been primarily the remarkable change in large concentrated market share in the dairy industry with large producers. What type of dairy are they producing? It's primarily low-value added dairy. It's powdered milk. Where does the powdered milk go? Where does this dairy go? Any ideas? Well, certainly Frontier is behind it. Frontier is a multinational, it's the third largest multinational dairy producer in the world. It owns 92% of the market share in New Zealand. That dairy is primarily going to Asia. So as China in Southeast Asia, as the diets change in Asia and in China, New Zealand's feeding the dairy in Asia and China. So you have 4.3 million people in New Zealand feeding roughly 280 million people. And most of that food, protein, and dairy is coming from the land, the low-lying areas. 30% of New Zealand's protected. It's primarily in nutrient-poor high country. So above the tree line, above the beech tree forests. 90% of their coastal wetlands have been filled or lost. Very similar in the California motif, where we've lost 92% in California. As I mentioned, we've lost family farms, and certainly dairy threatens their aquatic ecosystems. Recent study on vulnerabilities in New Zealand showed that catchment issues, water quality, water quantity, the loss of aquatic ecosystems due to dairy primarily and other grazing and industrial practices is probably about, a major contributor to the vulnerability of the ecosystems of New Zealand. Neat study out in Nature a couple months ago showed that New Zealand ranked on the bottom in terms of countries ranked with respect to their ecosystems, and that was based on a measurement that included the abundance and distribution of native vegetation, native habitat, number of endangered species, and water quality impacts. So New Zealand, within the last 14 years, has gone from 6th in the OECD in terms of, for example, the level of petroleum products used within their aquatic ecosystems to the number 1 country in the OECD using petroleum-based fertilizers for dairy. Also, it's not, I think, too remarkable to think that with the decline of ecosystems, you see an incredible number of species that are listed as threatened or endangered in New Zealand. So, a couple of things to think about. I think that there's clear evidence that we see a remarkable decline in the status of ecosystems in New Zealand, especially aquatic ecosystems. That is a direct consequence in changes in their landscape and changes in their riverscapes, in particular in their aquatic ecosystems due to dairy production. That dairy production is based on demand overseas in Asia and China. And let's bring that facade of the brand back into the debate. That brand is a social identity. It's not only part of the domestic identity, the social identity within the Maori and within the Kiwi, but it's also a brand that we buy into from abroad. And I think that brand is a double-edged sword. As the landscape changes, that brand is threatened and perhaps undermined. As the brand is undermined, social identity also changes and changes meaning and importance. And within New Zealand today, there's a rich debate over this brand today. That brand will certainly change. And as it changes, I think we're more likely to see a return to that sort of pastoral romanticism that drives New Zealand's heritage and cultural values. Perhaps that will, I think, give birth to a redemptive journey, as Leo Marx would say, or perhaps an earthly homecoming, to think about the lifeline and the river that connects people. So thank you.
Thank you to our speakers, and I'd like to invite you up for the question and answer. I think we've had a great overview of changing water and land use in different circumstances in the Far East and in New Zealand and in the Ogallala Aquifer area of the United States. So if everyone wants to come up, we'll have 20 minutes for questions and answers. Yes, and why don't we introduce ourselves to the speakers?
My name is Jakob. I'm a senior and I'm a poli-sci major. Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the New Zealand situation for Mr. McGuinness. You say that there might be a return to pastoralism at some point,
Well, I mean, I think when you lose a sense of place, you're motivated to return to something, to a sense of that place or community. And certainly with the transformation of the dairy industry, the concentration of the market within the hands of Fonterra in New Zealand, the devastation of the landscape, the changes in land use practices, despite the early progressiveness of their laws, as the dairy changes that landscape, I think in some respects you'll see this re-emergence of that pastoral heritage beginning. And that's perhaps a consequence of the threat of the land use on the brand itself or on the social identity. And I think I'm sort of following off of the lead of Leo Marx, and his great history, which is that you have multiple experiences, multiple epistemologies. The brand fades, but you still long for the brand of your heritage. And I would imagine the industrialization of the landscape invokes that brand, the history of the brand.
Yes.
So follow up, I'm Eve Vogel from UMass Amherst, and this is for Dr. McGinnis again, and you'll understand well why I'm asking this question when I give my talk in an hour or so. What did those river basin institutions have to do with this? Did they in any way mediate it, mitigate it, change it, play a role at all?
And if I may tap
Yep.
into that question, because mine was the same actually, was whether you thought industry had an influence in like the water degradation, if local councils put more importance on industry rather than conservation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was this great question. One of the important things to keep in mind is that, well, certainly institutions matter. And the regional councils that have been developed in New Zealand are very diverse institutions across the landscape. In some cases, you have very well-resourced institutions. You have a lot of institutional capacity and capability to deal with water quality issues. In areas with low-density populations, you don't. So I don't want to generalize across the regional councils, but some regional councils have taken on the issues of dairy a lot more seriously than others. Some areas are literally captured by the industry. So it would be a really neat study, actually, from a comparative dimension, to see how all these diverse regions deal with similar problems. And you'd probably find that institutions and the rules and the access to government, the due process, the private-public land interface, these types of things, the presence or absence of a policy fixer has a really important role in how councils are dealing with water quality issues. So great questions. Yeah.
Question for Pina. You talked about the change from wheat to corn. Did your study ever look at crop subsidy policy and looking at why people might have changed not necessarily for water, but for subsidies?
So actually we did, we look at the subsidies as well, but in our analysis, like the numbers that you see is kind of net of all these effects, because like what we are doing in our, again, the empirical specification that we use, we look at, basically, we compare counties which are exactly on the same state and have exactly the same soil type and et cetera, et cetera. So any subsidy that won't affect a particular county specifically wouldn't really affect our results. But you are right, actually. The period that we are looking at is also very well known, like at least post-1970s period. It's also well known as an area with like huge farm subsidies for corn production. But it's still like most people concerned about the biofuel discussion, and it's still a little bit earlier for that discussion. But again, the numbers that you see is net of all those.
I have a related question about the change in the crops. You said that it was relatively slow to respond. They made the change relatively after a long time after they had the water supply. And I wonder if you've looked at any comparative evidence. Is that typical that the change is slow, or that do farmers in other places adapt more quickly? Or?
So we don't really have much evidence in United States. Like, that's why I cannot answer for United States, but my main research area is in India. So if this was the Indian context, my answer would be yes, farmers are in general very slow. And one typical answer for that, and which is well documented in the literature, would be financial constraints. So farmers, when it's time to change from one crop to the other, the main reason that they are very slow in that they don't have money to, buy the new seeds or purchase, there can be two crops we are talking about one needs a different type of harvesting machine. So that would be the answer for Indian or developing country case. In United States, we have some ideas about maybe it's kind of a inertia situation, that is, I have a huge investment for the wheat cultivation. That is I bought lots of, farming machinery, etc. And maybe I wait for the depreciation of that. So that can be one answer. There is another answer, again, very United States specific, can be about the intellectual property rights. So what we looked at is actually intellectual property rights for this main irrigation technology expired after 1969, which can be a good coincidence for our purposes. But then, so our story would be, okay, there was only one firm which is producing that, which has the patent of the irrigation technology. And in that period, actually, there wasn't much of, farmers couldn't access to that technology, but only after 1970s they had. But when we looked at the numbers, that is not a story that we can support with data. So actually what happened is there's more or less the same amount of providers in the market before and after the patent expired. And one final thing can be an explanation again, especially in developing country settings, there are lots of evidence on that. Farmers can just learn learn from the experience of the other farmers. So most of the time, I don't want to be the first person to take the risk in my particular area, but I will want to see some other successful farmers doing that particular business. Because when you read through the historical evidence, you see that people complaining about, my parents were wheat farmers, we were doing that for decades, blah, blah, blah. And, it's a very scary thing. So we read through some agricultural extension agency notebooks and their publications, and that's more or less the answer for that people didn't want to be the first one to take the risk.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Ryan. I'm from Argentina. I really enjoy your presentation. Thank you very much. My question is by Professor McGuinness. Actually, it was extremely interesting. Anything about New Zealand, so it was extremely interesting presentation. The question that I have is, from a political economy approach, the description that you were giving the changes in New Zealand, one can compare analogy to the changes that are going, for example, with soybean production in South America, in Brazil, Argentina, which is basically led by the Chinese market. But the difference between Argentina, Brazil, and New Zealand is that in the New Zealand, for what you're telling me, there was already a developed institutional structure that was already embedded, not only at the institutional level, but it seems to be, it was, as you say, part of a branch of the country. So it was I imagine a strong political and ideological connection from the population with the country, which was not the case in Argentina and Brazil, in which the environmental agenda is an entirely secondary issue. So it's much easier to explain the process in Argentina and Brazil than to explain New Zealand, at least for me, because I imagine that this trend, these changes, it has to create internal turmoil. So my question is more, and it goes beyond the water issue, but more about the environmental agenda in general. How is and taking into account that New Zealand is a highly democratic country and fulfill all the standards of a Western democracy, etc. How has democratic politics in New Zealand responds to these changes that greatly affect the economic structure, the social structure, imagine, and the environmental situation of the country?
I'd just like to follow on because I had the same question, and actually brought into each of the participants, because I saw really each of the issues that you were presenting about as these sort of grand scale experiments that are affecting people, and to what extent are those people participating in this kind of struggle as their relationships to the environment change?
You want to start with that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Unless you would like to.
No, I'll continue too.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you'll get your answer in a moment. What do I want to say? I think what I've written about before and what I largely see when I go to Russia, particularly in the Far East, all over Russia, but especially the Far East, is that environment comes last. And the socio-economic political transitions that have happened for the past 22 years take precedent in everyone's minds. And this goes back to Pushpa's talk, talking about what do people do first? If you're under pressure to live and survive, you're going to switch to whatever resource or whatever mode of making money that you can first. And while you may care for the salmon, you care more about living for tomorrow and sending your kids perhaps to college than you might care about the life of a river for forever, right? And what's in that river forever. So structural changes, socioeconomic, political changes are huge, and I don't think we can forget those in thinking about environment. And when we start talking about transnational actors, and in some ways this goes to thinking about dairy and who's buying that dairy in New Zealand, we can't forget those actors as well, right? So structure is about governance, but also about markets.
You know, I'm a Californian, so when I reached out across the Pacific and landed a job in New Zealand, my answer to your question is based on living there for 2.5 years. And, you know, the political culture there, you know, one of the things we find out often when we travel and we visit places and we get to know people in different places is that, you know, what we take for granted often domestically through civil society and due process and administrative procedures doesn't exist in many places, and it doesn't exist in New Zealand. They don't have a strong civil society. The role of NGOs, you know, in terms of adversarial politics, in terms of litigation, isn't there. They do not litigate. They do not take decisions like what for their catchments to the courts. Their science has been privatized through a whole range of government directives. What we think like our NOAA or our scientific bodies through our academies have been privatized. They have 8 different scientific bodies in New Zealand. They have all been privatized, and they have to turn a profit. And so science is not accessible. It's not shared. It's client-based. It's captured science. And that influences the politics over the landscape as well. One of the things that I've done in extensive studies is looking at their marine systems and how they deal with their marine systems, which I think is very important given the number of islands. They do not have public policies in place today that require environmental impact statements for marine areas beyond 12 nautical miles, yet they've leased half their exclusive economic zone for oil exploration and development. They've leased roughly 1/3 of their exclusive economic zone for deep seabed mining, and there won't be risk assessments or impact assessments for that, and there's no due process for proposed oil development and the like. So that gives you some sense of the institutions at work in New Zealand, and like a lot of other places, international, this is where the brand plays out, you know, international attention for New Zealand's catchments and oceans. Although they are globally hotspots for biodiversity, those islands, people don't think about it. People think New Zealand's doing the right thing. I thought New Zealand was doing the right thing before I landed there and worked there. And to my surprise, having bought into the brand myself, I think that's a catch-22 for New Zealand, because international effort, let's say from the big endowments like Moore and Packard and Pew, they're not investing in New Zealand despite the biological diversity and the richness of the country, because they think it's doing the right thing. So this brand is being played out in multiple ways. So great question.
Okay. Sir.
Thanks, Charlie. I have a question that might include all 3 of you. I'm going to try to make it do that. And it's a question about the role of indigenous perspectives, voices, and perhaps epistemologies. Oglala is, of course, not a Euro-American word, and the kind of agriculture practice there is quite new. But that's probably my weakest case. the Maori point of view and political voice is, of course, inscribed in New Zealand history very early, I think in the Treaty of Waitangi, and it's very prominent, and it's very different from indigenous rights, as it were, in this country. So I'm really interested in the what you might have to say, Michael, about Maori perspectives on the land as compared to pastoral, which is a cultural mode imported from Europe, pastoralism, which is an economic, agro-industry that's destroying the landscape clearly. So really like to hear about that. But also, Jessica, you seem to suggest that subsistence fishing is kind of a culprit in overharvesting. And it's my understanding that the real culprit in global overfishing is overcapitalized industrial fishing fleets, including those of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, which were responsible for pulse fishing in global waters before the Magnuson Act established the 200-mile EEZs, et cetera, et cetera. The Soviets were nothing like snowy white innocence when it came to global overfishing. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts about the indigenous peoples of Sakhalin and Kamchatka and the future of fishing as they practice it. So a lot of stuff there. I just see where it goes.
Jessica?
I think I'm the person who has less to say.
I'll start.
The great questions. Katiakatanga is institutionalized in their treaties and their post-settlement agreements with iwi. Iwi are very diverse. They have a history of not getting along. Pakeha, the European settlement, those cultural conflicts, I think, remain. But it's important to keep in mind that perhaps New Zealand is a good example of a post-primitivism with its fact that the most 30% of the dairy, at least, is owned by Māori through cooperatives with Fronterra. 45% of the fisheries, multi-billion-dollar industry, is owned by iwi and Maori in Dakota. And some of the iwi are very powerful. They have their own science. They are well-educated actors. And, when I was interviewing folks for this work and this research, I found that they often reflect that ontological divide as well, where epistemologically they yearn for their past, their language, their community, and they fight and resist the colonization effects always. And they yearn for that language and they yearn for that community structure. But it's also a structure that is corporatized and classified, in terms of class-based systems of iwi relationships, and divided and contested. No different. So in some respects, there's this image of iwi fighting off Pakeha influence. But the other side of it is, the decolonizing aspects of iwi who've now become Pakeha. And so the shifting boundaries, the cultural boundaries of New Zealand are really complicated and really interesting, and how they're being played out socially or ecologically, I think, is a really important part of it. So great question.
That's also, excuse me, a great question for thinking about the Pacific Russian context as well. Now, I by no means meant to paint the Soviet practices as snowy white. Certainly, especially not out in the ocean. But one thing I will say in terms of thinking about the Sea of Okhotsk, 40% of Russia's fish economy comes from that one sea basin. And the Japanese also fish in there. So it's a very messy animal, if you will, immediately. So I'd like to leave that one alone for just a minute to think about the very near shore and upstream fishing that's done by both indigenous and local people. And now I put them in the same category. So indigenous as well, and let me tell you why, as well as Soviet, if you will, newcomers. Why do I do that? For thinking about how they practice collecting fish. So let's not forget in the 1930s through the 50s, this region was collectivized, meaning people were taken out of their original settlements and put in larger ones, particularly to raise agricultural crops, and one of the worst regions of the world to do agriculture. This left a lot of people fish less, right? And it was illegal for them to go collect fish in multiple places, including their homelands. So this, while people still did it, right, this was what happened to both indigenous and local peoples. Post-1991, there is some return to those home places, but by and large, the infrastructure is so devastated for them that there's nowhere for people to go, and there are no materials, have been no materials for people to rebuild anything in these places since then. So initial villages, indigenous villages are gone, and people stay in the Soviet settlements, and they fish in Soviet net catching ways at the mouths of rivers. So that's why I put those two together, which I'm sure someone could really lash me for. But in a lot of ways, that's the scenario for all the people who still consider this an ecological homeland, which are both the local people who have stayed, many of those people who could left in the 1990s, but not the indigenous groups that are there, and there are about 3 that are important for fishing communities in both Kamchatka and Sakhalin. Does that help? Okay, good.
I hear both of you saying, to some extent, let's not romanticize indigeneity too much, and thank you.
I think that uses up our time. With apologies, I think Pina is okay on the. Did you want to?
Oh, no, she said thank you.
Well, it's going to be for Pinar.
We want the wrap
so maybe
up.
It gives her a chance. Well, I don't know if it's a deep question. Anyway, Pinar, you had one of your slides up intrigued me where you had the total value, or I guess the additional value you were estimating of having the aquifer there. And as I recall on that slide, you said it was something like $29 billion or something in 1974, and then
$2002.
Oh, in $2002, but then you had later, it was lower or something?
Okay, so what I was saying is that the peak of the value of the water was around 1970, 1974. Oh, sorry.
They recorded.
The peak of the valuation of Ogallala, according to our findings, and which is supported by some anecdotal evidence as well, is that 1974 is the peak of the valuation, that is 29 million. In 2002, of course, like with the huge extraction of water, the amount of water is less, and people's expectations about the future of Ogallala is so much less. So in 2002, that goes down almost like half of its value.
I see, so it was extraction that did that then.
Extraction did, but more than the extraction. Actually, when you look at the numbers, that's why I had this extra line saying that maybe actually the real value is a little bit more than that, because more than the total, the extraction and the decrease in the water levels, it's kind of the people's expectations. Because around early 2000, there was this huge media discussion in the area about how the water is running out and how there won't be any water, which is not necessarily true. Actually, even from an economist perspective, not just talking about physical access to water, there is water there. And actually, if we know how to use it smarter, we will use it for a long time. But then, talking about the institutions, etc., even in a country where there are lots of environmental regulations, we are actually giving wrong incentives to our farmers, both through subsidized water and all those sorts of subsidies, but also through our tax law, for instance. When you look at a decision of Court of Appeals in 1965, according to the U.S. tax code, Ogallala water is taxed as a mineral resource. What does it mean? What is the taxation behind the mineral resources? If I have a mine, coal mine, the way it works is that I can actually use I can extract some coal in a given year, and I say that, now the value of my mine is that much lower. Now there's less less coal in it, so I can actually deduct that from my taxes, which is great for the coal mine owner because that's a private property. It's perfect, using depreciation for your company car or something. But in case of Ogallala, this doesn't really work. Why? Because we are talking about huge lake, which there are lots of users from different counties. Forget about all the thousands of farmers which are extracting water. So we are just telling that now we are giving you some kind of a subsidy to extract more from this common source. Now by extracting more, like reporting that they use more water in a given year, they pay less taxes. So of course, we have this kind of a pinkish picture that's saying that if we know how to use it better, local law will last for a long time. Of course, if this conditional on that government changes some of its policies and stop giving incentives, not only in Ogallala region, but all over the country, incentivizing water use and also subsidizing insane amounts like the water-intensive crops the same way.
Bill, last question.
I think easy to follow up on, but from your experience in India and with your garden, what lessons would you pass on to the countries who are about to develop or manage aquifer in South America, which is huge and virtually untapped?
So one thing is that actually, if you are starting in a new area, which would be perfect. The problem in the US is that, for instance, one big problem in US, like what we observe in our data and reading through the Ogallala history, is that every state, there are 8 states on top of Ogallala, and each of them has its own rules and laws about how we can extract water, which is not really working. Again, going back to my previous answer, they're all extracting water from the same bathtub, no? More or less, they're more complicated than a bathtub, but basically they're all extracting from the same water source. But then you tell that Texas government is giving their farmers the right to extract nonstop, whereas in Nebraska there are so many restrictive rules. So first of all, there should be some kind of a, instead of local management of the aquifer, depending on the region that you are, there should be some kind of a board which is managing the entire thing as a whole, and the rules should be universal for every single farmer. That's one thing. And the other thing is that what we see just looking at different states and different laws, in that sense as well, US is a great experiment because every single state has its own rules, or even every water district has its own rules. For instance, there are some rules which are telling you, if I have a well in a certain place, in some states I cannot dig another well in the certain amount of distance. In some states, there are some laws which are saying that, actually, you can dig a well wherever you want. Such and such. So there are some things that we can definitely say about, one is that the universal management of the aquifer, instead of having local management, because again, there are lots of externalities going on. Actually, this is a different project that we are working on. The second is there should be no subsidization of the water use. In India, for instance, going back to my Indian experience, in India, one big problem is the electricity subsidies for agriculture. So you cannot, I'm sure that there's a huge aquifer actually now people start to talk about in Africa as well. I'm sure that people or the governments or international organizations will encourage governments to subsidize the extraction of water through electrification. But what happened in India is that when you look at the electricity excess, there are some places that just desert and you see rice field. What is rice? Rice is a crop which grows in the water, not even if cotton is a water-intensive crop, rice is not in that scale. It's out somewhere that it's growing in the water. But in India, you walk around and you see all this rice field in the middle of the desert. Why? Because people are using free electricity. They're paying zero cost to access water, and they just irrigate the water. So there are some lessons that we can learn both from Indian experience and then, again, the US experience. US experience in terms of the laws about how to give the property rights about the water, because they're kind of a step ahead, and in India, how not to incentivize water use.
Great. Well, a couple of overview comments. It seems to me very interesting that these are very different political systems, very different ecosystems, very different industries. And yet the commonalities are in many ways greater than the customized situations. For whatever reason, it seems to me, in every one of these cases, these resources are being utilized in a non-sustainable way. They're all, each case, mining the asset, whether it's the nutrients in the soil or whether it's the river systems or whether it's the water tables. And at the end, a generation or two from now, it's hard to imagine very much will be in any of these places. That raises the question whether supply and demand will ultimately change the pricing and so on and so forth. But at the moment, obviously, something in the supply and demand system is making it profitable to use extractive practices. And without implying causation, the other cross-cutting issue is, in every case, it's a global market that's driving the technology, I think the business strategy. None of these ecosystems are producing for their regional or local marketplace. So if we go back to Timmy Meyer's introductory comments last evening and look at some of the macro questions of growing populations, growing wealth, and so on and so forth, and the globalization of markets and production, these are quite sobering case studies, at least in 2013. So let's give our speakers a round of applause, and to Adrian for his great co-chairing.